Welcome to what promises to be a very stimulating evening. My name is Jules Pelta Feldman, and I am postdoctoral fellow for the research project Performance, Conservation, Materiality, Knowledge, which is sponsored by the Swiss National Science Foundation and which makes its home at the Bern Academy of the Arts here in Switzerland. I welcome you also on behalf of my colleagues in this project and in another called Activating Fluxus, namely Hanna Hölling, Emily Magnan, Aga Wilocha, and Josephine Ellis, and our artistic collaborators, Marcus Gosselt and Valerian Mali. Our two projects are the hosts of this evening's event, which is made possible by the research department of Bern Academy of the Arts, headed by Thomas Gottman, who's here tonight. Hello, Thomas. And of the Institute of Materiality in Art and Culture, headed by Sebastian de Broskin. The discussion is part of the Forschungsmittwoch or Research Wednesday series. So before we begin, I would just like to briefly introduce our two research projects. Performance, Conservation, Materiality, Knowledge applies the disciplinary lens of conservation to postulate and formulate the afterlives and longevity of performance art, long considered an essentially fugitive genre. And Activating Fluxus, which is also led by Hanna Hölling, investigates the aftermath of Fluxus objects, events, and ephemera created in the 1960s, 70s in Switzerland, Europe, and internationally. The project considers the transitory aspects of Fluxus art forms not destined for preservation, and I'm sure we will find many points of connection among these projects and the topics to be discussed today. Tonight, we are celebrating the launch of this book, Object, Event, Performance, Art, Materiality, and Continuity since the 1960s. And as you can see, if you haven't yet bought the book, you have a chance to do so for 30% off. The book asks what it means to conserve artworks that fundamentally address and embody the notion of change. And through this questioning, guide us to reevaluate the meaning of art, of objects, and of materiality itself. Object, Event, Performance considers a selection of post-1960s artworks that have all been chosen for their instability, changeability, performance elements, and processes that pose questions about their relationship to conservation practices. With chapters by Hanna B. Higgins, Hanna B. Hölling, Gregory Zinman, Andrea Gyorody, Alison D'Amato, Megan Metcalf, Rebecca Uchil, Susanne Neubauer, Beryl Graham, and Johannes Hiddinger, it is surely a welcome resource on contemporary conservation for art historians, scholars of performance, dance, theater, and museum studies, curators, and conservators. We will begin this evening with an introduction from the book's editor, Hanna Hölling, followed by brief presentations from four of its contributing authors, Gregory Zinman, Megan Metcalf, Andrea Gyorody, and Hanna B. Higgins. Finally, we will conclude with a discussion in which you all are invited to take part. So we won't be addressing questions after each individual presentation, but please do share your questions in the chat or save them to ask later, and don't be shy. We're all friends here. And now I will kick things off by introducing Hanna. Hanna number one. Hanna B. Hölling is research professor at Bern Academy of the Arts, where she leads two research projects funded by the Swiss National Science Foundation: Performance, Conservation, Materiality, Knowledge, and Activating Fluxus. Her research, teaching, and publications address subjects in art history and theory, media and material culture studies, museology, conservation, and more generally, American and European art created since the 1960s. She is the author of Pike's Virtual Archive on Time, Change, and Materiality in Media Art, published by the University of California Press in 2017, and Revisions, Zen for Film, published by Bard Graduate Center in 2015. Hanna, I am pleased to give the floor to you.
Thank you so much, Jules, for this fantastic introduction. Thank you so much for also all your support in preparing of this event. There is a very strange feedback I am hearing. I am not quite sure if this feedback is heard by everyone, but no, it ceased to be okay. So again, thank you so much, Jules. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Hanna Hölling, and it is my distinct pleasure to be able to present a few reflections on our book Object, Event, Performance, Art, Materiality, and Continuity since the 1960s, the book which has just been published from Graduate Center in the series Cultural Histories of the Material World, edited by Peter Miller. You can see it here in the background, but I'm gonna take the book in my hand and present to you again. This book came together, as Jules already mentioned, and became what it is due to the generous contributions by its authors. So before going any further, please let me just again warmly greet them here. Many of them are here with us today. Hanna Higgins, this is in the appearance order of appearance in the book. Hanna Higgins, Gregory Zinman, Andrea Gyorody, Alison D'Amato, Megan Metcalf, Rebecca Ukil, Susanna Neubauer, Beryl Graham, and Johannes Hedinger, who contributed their expertise and passion to the volume, and without whom this book would never have materialized. I know almost all of you are with us today, and you will hear brief presentations by Hanna, Greg, and Andrea and Megan, as Jules mentioned, just in a few minutes. And if you would like to discuss with our other authors, it will be the possibility to do so in our Q&A in the roundtable after the short presentations. So let me get to the presentation. It matters what ideas we use to think other ideas with. It matters what matters we use to study other matters with. It matters what stories we tell to tell other stories with. It matters what nots, not notes, what thoughts think thoughts. And this is one of my favorite quotations from Donna Haraway's Staying with the Trouble, a book that the feminist theories published in 2016, as it exemplifies the entanglement of our world and the importance of our choices and how even the tiniest parts in the system determine the kind of the working or the mattering of the universe. I am convinced that our book is an evidence of such successful working together. The book is about the modes of artistic expression that emerged since the late 1950s and the beginning of the 1960s. Happenings, performance, video, experimental film, fluxus activities, and the emerging practices of media art that question the idea of art that endures unchanged and thus might be subject to a single interpretation. In contrast to traditional visual art, the blending of genres and media began to transform not only the curatorial and museum collecting practices, but also the traditional function and mandate of conservation, which became augmented to accept the inherent dynamism and changeability of artworks. The book asks, how do these works endure over time despite their material and conceptual changes? How do their identities unfold in relation to ruling knowledge, values, politics, and culture? The book examines the physical and immaterial aspects of artworks at the intersection of art history with theory, material culture studies, and conservation, focusing on artworks that evade the familiar stability or the forever aspect of traditional art forms. Intrinsically changeable and often of short duration, these unstable artworks challenge art, conservation, and museological discourses. Not only do they test standard assumption of what, how, and when an artwork is or can be, but they also put forward the notion of materiality in the constant flux that plays a significant role in the creation and mediation of meaning. The conception of conservation put forward in this book is an extended conservation, or the titular continuity. Conservation here is a participative practice, an epistemic that is knowledge-generating activity that encompasses many cultures and understanding of what it means to conserve. I mean, with cultures of conservation, the sets of social practices characterized by shared values, conventions, attitudes, goals, and patterns of human knowledge, as well as beliefs and behaviors that depend on the capacity to learn and transmit knowledge to succeeding generations. The formation of these cultures apply not only to such aspects of contemporaneity as the continuance of medium, network, and institution-specific cultures of care, but also to their historical evolution through restoration, rehabilitation, renewal, and revival. Today, however, conservation not only acts within, but is also enacted outside its safe spaces, analytical laboratories, heritage institutions, and museum departments, just as conservation thinking persists in other domains, in minds, hands, and practices, from curatorial, archival, and registrarial to artistic. The cultures and understanding of conservation, including highly specialized conservation scholarship, are contingent on the subjective viewpoints and situated knowledge of the actor participants in conservation, which are in turn determined by the conditions in which this knowledge is produced. The encounters with the materiality of artworks in this book originate from the author's interest in the conditions that determine an artwork's ongoing life. They emphasize the importance of conservation thinking and thinking about conservation, and explore how these factors enrich, shape, and help reformulate theoretical and historical discourses. Thus, what follows spans active learning from the past, acting in the present, and glimpses of the future. The already well-established turn towards materials and materialities in recent decades is refocused through and as a conservation question. We aim to attract many other voices and responses that will continue to expand discursive frameworks and challenge established disciplinary boundaries. Object Event Performance combines the perspectives of art historians, media, performance, and conservation. Perspective of historians of art, media, performance, and conservation, as well as artists, scholars, and professionals working in media and curatorial fields that are devoted to the material and conceptual lives of artworks. The essays reflect on the ways in which artworks created since the 1960s are conserved, perpetuated, presented, and conceptualized, each from a particular perspective. This volume is based on the belief that cross-pollination among disciplines and professions generates new perspectives on art and its world, as well as novel encounters with the ever-changing materiality of artworks. The essays expose the entangled material, spatial, and temporal relationships in which artworks exist. In addition to placing conservation questions in dialogue with humanities disciplines, the contributions to this volume attempt to acknowledge conservation as valid theoretical disciplinary framework that can be accessed and operated not only by conservators, but also by non-conservators. Crucially, this book allows the participants in conservation and non-conservators to take a stand. Here are a few questions that were taken up by the authors of this book. How the works of art transition over time as they are impacted by the processes of institutionalizing, presenting, archiving, and conserving artworks. What does it mean to conserve, document, and archive recent art? Can the notion of conservation be sustained? How do curatorial approaches and methods of documenting and distributing artworks affect their identity? And I will very briefly actually share, excuse me, the table of content here. It's very slowly coming up. Yeah, yes, you might see it now. Okay, so there are a few questions with which I just began, and you might see them reflected in the contents of the book, in the chapters. What does it mean to conserve, document, and archive recent art? Can the notion of conservation be sustained? How do curatorial approaches and methods of documenting and distributing artworks affect their identity? And these are questions really that have been pertinent to all authors in the book. What is the relation between a work and its core instruction, its core instruction or notation? What role do these considerations play in the work's material and conceptual continuity? And those questions were pertinent to chapters by Hanna Higgins, Alexandra Matto, Megan Metcalf, and myself. What if an artwork eternally returns in background forms of moving image, moving also because of its medial transpositions in Gregory Zinman? What if an artwork is inseparable from its environment, so much so that its preservation must include the consideration of the viewshed, because it is impossible to define a single vantage point from which to view the work, and thus its beginning and end in Rebecca Ukil? Excuse me. What if display and curatorial work perpetuate works that are particularly sensitive to the interrelatedness of their physical components and their spaces in Susanne Neubauer? Where should the so-called new media be placed in relation to the singularity and uniqueness of traditional objects, and how does system thinking allow us to deal with the new media variability? In Beryl Graham, where does the archive begin and end? How does it relate to the artwork that it archives? How does one make sense of the archival preservation of the artwork's traces, props, and leftovers? And this is pertinent to Johannes Hedinger in his open-ended work, Bloch. Johannes Hedinger and Markus Gossold created the work Bloch, and the chapter closes the book. What is the artwork's relation to time? Can artworks be conceived as events, performances, and processes? What consequences would such conception have for their perpetuation? I think these questions are present in all chapters, but in particular in my contribution on Franz Erhard Walter. Can performance be a method to keep the material and structural aspects of the works produced since the 1960s and 70s alive? Can it work against the deadening effects of relegating these works to the archive in Hanna Higgins? And lastly, what if a heavily decayed, perhaps even a dead work is allowed back to the limelight, not only to promote a radical aesthetic, but to test whether conservation allows a work to decay? In Andrea Gyorody. All in all, the authors in this volume offer approaches to answering this and related questions that develop out of a slow analysis or condition reporting of sorts that works toward a deep awareness of their conceptual and physical frangibility, one that reveals the inner structure of things, their material flows and dynamics. And most importantly, one that enhances material knowledge. Sorry, I have a... I hope I was able to awake your curiosity about the book and about the presentation by our eminent guest that will follow shortly. Let me take a moment to acknowledge that this book would not have been possible without the generous support of Peter Miller, the series editor and dean of the Bard Graduate Center in New York City, as well of Dan Lee, the center's publishing director, who invited me to think about this book back in 2015. The invitation followed the conference Revisions, Object Event Performance since the 1960s, organized on September 21, 2015 for the opening of the exhibition Revisions and for film at Bard Graduate Center Gallery, New York. Both the symposium and the exhibition resulted from a research project during my Andrew W. Mellon visiting professorship at Bard Graduate Center, and I am vastly indebted to the Mellon Foundation for their support of the Bard's initiative, Cultures of Conservation, and my position therein. A subsequent session in February 2018 at the College Art Association in Los Angeles, as well as further discussions among scholars of performance, dance, media, conservation, art history, and material culture studies, as well as curators, conservators, and other professionals developed the topic further. I also owe thanks to my graduate students at the Bard Graduate Center and in the Department of History of Art, University College London, especially those who contributed to the performative seminars on the occasion of Intermedia Art and Materiality, graduate module that I taught at UCL, and I know that some of them are present here today. So it's my pleasure to see you. My further work on this book was supported by my then home department of History of Art at UCL and the Terra Foundation for the American Art at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, DC. And the finishing touches on the book were made in Bern at the HKB, Institute for Materiality and Art and Culture, for the Materiality in Art and Culture, also the host of today's event, for which we are very, very grateful. The concluding steps were made as the research project, Performance, Conservation, Materiality, Knowledge, made possible by the general support of the Swiss National Science Foundation, began in Bern. The SNF has since founded our second project, Activating Fluxus, which is thematically related to the book, as Jules mentioned, and the SNF remains an invaluable sponsor of our activities, for which I and my research teams are present here remain more than thankful. Finally, and again, my deepest thanks to the contributors to this volume: Hanna Higgins, Gregory Zinman, Andrea Gyorody, Alison D'Amato, Megan Metcalf, Rebecca O'Keefe, Susanne Neubauer, Beryl Graham, and Johannes Hedinger for their passion, dedication, and responsiveness to editorial suggestions. Thank you so much, and I am passing the mic back to Jules.
We will now hear from Gregory Zinman, who is Associate Professor in the School of Literature, Media, and Communication at the Georgia Institute of Technology. He's the author of Making Images Move, Handmade Cinema and the Other Arts, University of California Press, 2020, and his writing on film and media has appeared in many worthy journals and periodicals. He has also programmed film and media at a diverse collection of venues. Greg, looking forward to your presentation. The floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Jules. I'm going to share my screen with everyone. And thanks to Jules for all of your hard work in putting this event together. Thanks to Sophia for all of your technical expertise. And of course, thanks to Hanna Hölling for bringing us all together and all of your incredible work on this important volume. I'll begin today with a quote from the artist at the heart of my brief presentation, Nam-June Paik. Compared to satellite, exhibition is just peanuts. In a 1989 interview with Japanese architect Arata Izazaki, media artist Nam-June Paik reflected on his recent trio of satellite broadcast works, Good Morning, Mr. Orwell from 1984, Bye Bye Kipling from 1986, and Wrap Around the World from 1988, saying, quote, "You are only born once. You only die once. The most important things happen only once. A human being has an essential yearning or angst for the non-repeatable. The reason I became well known through destructive art was also because of this non-repeatability. Once you break an expensive piano, it cannot be put back together. Once you throw water on the ground, you cannot scoop it back up. From this fear and yearning born of the fragility of life, our philosophy of the quote unquote eternal return emerges," end quote. Paik here connects his satellite works, one-off international television broadcasts beamed into millions of homes, to his earlier action music pieces. Those pieces, such as one for violin from 1962, saw the artist playing an instrument by bashing it to smithereens and were easily legible as non-repeatable events. As real-time performances, the satellite works were non-repeatable events of another sort, offering a dizzying compendium of art, music, dance, and sport from multiple nations, enhanced by Paik's characteristic image effects. In an era characterized by intensifying Cold War conflict and the threat of nuclear annihilation, Paik's satellite pieces offered sincere, if fleeting, moments of international communion. Yet, even as the satellite pieces faded from the screen and their original viewers returned to their everyday lives, the works would experience a series of returns. As with so much of Paik's output, the satellite works provided the artist with self-recyclable material, first as edited single-channel video versions that could be distributed and exhibited as art world matter, secondly, appearing in his increasingly large multi-monitor installations, and finally, as various forms of online viewing. Each of these returns was not merely a recurrence in the Nietzschean sense of exact repetition of a prior event or sensation. Rather, it was a mutation or metapsychosis, a remix that curator David Ross calls Paik's quote-unquote video compost. The eternal returns of the satellite pieces constitute an aggregated body of work that continues to change and take on new life even in the present day. Now, how the satellite pieces managed to become the élan vital of many of Pake's later artworks, and how those artworks pose challenges to the reception and preservation of live video art constitutes the longer version of this paper that you'll find in the book. Pake's self-created media ecology finds him reworking his own art to new ends and represents a kind of me-mix as opposed to remix. And you see this borne out by the title of My Mix 81, for example. And this takes not just images, but concepts as well from one media formation and applies them to another. Indeed, the ideas undergirding the production and continued circulation of the satellite pieces opens up pathways for rethinking Pake's oeuvre, as well as the relationships between the preservation, exhibition, and understanding of the history of video art. In the immediate aftermath of Good Morning, Mr. Orwell, Pake's enthusiasm for satellite art was unbounded. 1 year after its airing, he wrote that the platform represented, quote, the highest art form humankind has invented, as the miracle is the cornerstone of every major religion in the world. Onceness constitutes the very motor of human history. Through live video art, we are finally able to deal very concretely with the central problems of human existence: chance, hazard, bet, venture. Pascal and Sartre would be very jealous of video artists, end quote. Onceness was a concept rooted in Pake's Fluxus performances, one that he applied to his decades-long inquiry into the way media technologies could be repurposed as conduits for communication, participation, and collaboration. Sparked by the appeal of live television, Onceness was about conveying a sense of spontaneity and danger to the normally tightly controlled realm of broadcasting. It contained, as Pake wrote 3 weeks after the broadcast of Good Morning, Mr. Orwell, a, quote, mystique, not recordable in the videotape, end quote, that resulted in a work wherein, quote, a delicate, fragile, yet concrete harmony was stretched between millions of highbrow families of America, end quote. As a means of making art, Onceness was both shocking and ephemeral, providing a different kind of interaction with media for artist and audience alike. Live video art, at least conceptually, also complicated the artwork's status as a commodity. Its non-repeatability did not mean that it was created outside of the circulation and systems of global capital, but it did mean that it did not function in a typical way in terms of the traditional art market. Now, this was appealing for Pake, who consistently sought to make audiences participants rather than mere consumers, and who inveighed against art world norms related to the dissemination of creative works and acts. A live broadcast on public television, after all, could not be editioned and subsequently sold to a few wealthy collectors. Despite their onceness, the satellite pieces hardly ceased to exist once they'd been broadcast, living on in a variety of edits. These single-channel versions of the satellite pieces are the ones most familiar to the art-going public. While they serve as crucial instantiations of the work, they necessarily lose the initial airing sense of performative daring-do. No longer live, they are incomplete documents of erratic diminishment, cleaned-up displays of Pake's ingenuity and collaborative spirit, lacking the live wire precarity that made them singular events. To that point, it is currently impossible to see the satellite pieces as they were originally presented. In this way, Pake has, intentionally or not, enacted a perverse kind of preservation, in that he's ensured that the initial airings remain singular occurrences, incapable of being perfectly replicated. As they existed for their runtimes, the satellite pieces did not function as traditional artworks to be bought and sold, but consumed for free on public television. The satellite pieces were not about an artist hawking his wares to well-heeled collectors. They were about attempting to communicate on a nearly unprecedented scale. As Pake wrote, quote, "We have shown a way to make peace a thrilling entertainment," end quote. At the same time that Pake was exploring the possibility of reaching mass audiences via satellite, a new multi-screen platform was starting to become available in Europe and the United States. These vast arrays of linked video monitors, known as video walls, were the province of trade shows and theme parks, department store windows, and Broadway shows, and they became one of Pake's preferred mediums in the 1980s and 1990s. just as he had reconfigured other media throughout his career, from fashioning prepared pianos to placing magnets on television sets. Paik recognized that he could use the spectacular qualities of the video wall to revisit his older works while fostering new collaborations. The video walls were, for Paik, the perfect vehicle for remixing and recontextualizing the satellite pieces for new audiences and different environments. The video walls were at once an extension of the satellite works and an indirect refutation of them. The scale of the audience Paik enjoyed for the satellite pieces, which reached into the tens of millions, seemingly began to inhabit the material qualities of Paik's multi-monitor installations. It was as if he wanted to bring the millions of televisions receiving the broadcasts in individual living rooms around the world and together in a combined electronic fever dream of simultaneity and proliferation. The satellite works had spurred Paik to think about acceleration and velocity. As he wrote shortly after the broadcast of Wrap Around the World, quote, "Satellite art has gone into the realm of future tense," end quote. Paik's video walls are colossal installations, but their video components are a glut of decontextualized information. No longer charmingly clunky utopian visions of global connectivity, the satellite pieces adorn these video walls as baubles hanging on the redwoods of the technological sublime, monuments to data flow where Paik's previously valorized topics of interaction, two-way communication, and collaboration vanish in favor of a seeming indifference to the humans beholding their spectacle. Whereas the satellite works went out of their way to represent quote unquote foreign people to other nations, the video walls seemingly diminish humanity. A more generous reading of them would take that feature as the work's central point. They instantiate a mediated world where image proliferation, drawn from a history of image making, re-edited, filtered, and processed to the extent where its origins are occluded or made suspect, outstrips humanity itself. Paik was, to varying degrees, platform agnostic, always looking to discover how images could be made, reshaped, disseminated, and shared. It would have been fascinating to see what Paik would have made with other post-video platforms, such as augmented, mixed, and virtual reality, and whether the satellite works would have continued to manifest as reoccurrences, finding new homes and new technological bodies. Ripe for rediscovery and reconsideration from both technological and transnational perspectives, the satellite pieces provide an opportunity to rethink Paik's work and video art more broadly. Quote, "Thanks to technology," Paik wrote, "we can live not only in the future, but also in the past. We have to go back and forth," end quote. Equal turns prescient and naive, hopeful and electrifying, the satellite pieces continue to remain works ahead of their time. Video art's past and present, future tense. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Greg. That was fascinating. I look forward to hearing more during the discussion. And as I said, if you have questions, please feel free to share them already in the chat or to save them for the discussion we'll have at the end. And now I will continue on introducing our next speaker, Megan Metcalf, who is a scholar as well as a practitioner of dance, visual art, and their intersection. She is currently History of Art and Visual Culture Fellow at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. And her research has been supported by a number of prestigious institutions, and her writing has appeared in numerous publications. Megan is currently working on a book about the appearance of dance and performance in contemporary art spaces, and I very much look forward to your presentation. Megan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jules, and thank you everyone for joining us. And of course to Hanna for inviting me to participate in this important volume. I'm going to share my screen, and I'm just going to talk rather casually through my contribution in hopes that it will provoke you to take a look at it. So my chapter began with this oddity, or really a curiosity, that I observed when I was doing field work at a retrospective of the artist Simone Forti. This was, as you can see, it is an onion balanced on the lip of a bottle. And I saw it hanging out at the side of the gallery when we were working on the installation. So here it is highlighted in the background. That's the artist in the foreground with the curator, Sabine Breitweiser. So this show was incredibly devoted to historical accuracy. It attempted to recreate a number of Forti's performances from their very first presentations, and it gathered together a great deal of her material production. It was very invested in presenting her as a visual artist and not as a movement artist, which is, or in addition to her being a movement artist, which is how she had been known up until that point, or largely known up until that point. She's an incredibly influential figure for American dance, and has also made artworks in many different mediums for a very long time. So at the edge of this exhibition was this onion, and it actually wasn't the one in the upper left that you see here. It's the one that I captured in my own iPhone photographs, and it did not have a sprout. And the artist let the curator know, like, this one isn't going to work because it's not going to sprout during the run of the exhibition. What she's doing in the middle photograph is reading a text that was presented on the wall without any context. It presents this narrative of the onion sprouting and then falling off of the bottle. So this whole thing seemed to me really strange. What was it doing there? It had a title, but that title was one thing in the catalog, which called it Onion on a Bottle, and another thing in the exhibition, which called it Onion Walk. It had two dates, which is fairly common, but it was 1961/2014. And I knew a lot about the artist production, and I just couldn't figure out what this was doing there. So my chapter traces my journey through finding out what it was, and I'll relay some of that to you. Most of all, I wanted to know what was authorizing it in this context. Like, it was in a museum, so it was presented as having some kind of fidelity to the past or to the artist. But beyond that, I didn't really know where it came from. So I started asking questions. The immediate precedent for it was fairly easy. The curator had seen this at in Madrid the year before in an exhibition that was bringing together the production of a number of contributors to a work of conceptual art, or rather sometimes also called poetry. This volume, an anthology, included 5 texts by Simone Forti, and the exhibition in Madrid was working to create a material show for this publication. And the possible artworks for that show were a little bit slim. The main archive for an anthology was not open to researchers, and so they were coming up with a lot of different ideas on how to manifest these works in the present. So staging Forti's works were somewhat obvious in that regard. They restaged a couple of the performances that are on the page in an anthology, and this is the onion as you see it in the foreground. So they perched that onion on the bottle and set it to do its walk, or to do, to fall off the bottle. And in this regard, that's fairly straightforward. It's fairly simple. It was a performance. They staged the onion as a performance. They interpreted that text as a score. And that's fairly straightforward. It's an easy interpretation to do. These share the page with the onion text, which is at the top. These two works, called the Dance Constructions, were created around the same time as Forti contributed these texts to an anthology, which was sometime in this early 1961. So these two works are works of dance, and that kind of combine the features of dance and sculpture. They also are works, something like conceptual art, which you can see via their inclusion in an anthology. They also, and these works have been restaged hundreds, if not thousands of times in the case of Huddle, which is what we call the top one. You can see these are historic performances of these works, but certainly not their first performances. And of course, that text shares so much with other works that were born in that period. So so using the text as a score for enacting a work in performance or even enacting a work in sculpture is a very common thing to do. George Brecht's drip music is an example of that. These three different iterations, as a text, as a live performance, and as a sculpture, have been called all the same work. That's one of the chief arguments in Natalie Haren's important book. What anthology does, that book, what it does is emphasize the closeness of these forms. But what I had always understood about that score, about the Onion score, the one that Forti had contributed to the anthology, was its significance for dance, which is that she read it aloud in a composition class. She stood up in front of her composition class and read it aloud to her companions. And in the context of that composition class, where students were applying John Cage's scores to movement, they were conducting these brief little experiments to generate really quick dances, really short compositions. Forti was asserting that a score could be that a text could be a dance, that reading could be a dance, much in the same way that her colleague Steve Paxton proposed that eating a sandwich could be a dance. And this is how I'd always understood it. And I felt really attached to this idea of the text not needing any kind of a physical manifestation, simply the artist reading it or simply that act. I felt really attached to this. So I was worried, of course, that the installation was changing the nature of the thing, that the Onion was changing the nature of the thing. But the more I thought about it, the more I was thinking, what if, and this is what I trace in the chapter, what if, in addition to being a provocation for dance, the dance report, as Forti called it at the time, is a provocation for institutions. And the more I thought about it, the more I looked around and saw, like, actually, this type of production is all over the museum. We see it especially strongly because of Forti's ties with dance, because of her background with dance. But this kind of production is everywhere. So we see it in the fabrication and refabrication of minimalist artworks, sculptures. We see it in something like the Solowit wall drawings. We see it in Lawrence Weiner's text. This one in particular has to do with ephemerality. These are installed for the length of the show, and then they're usually thrown away or painted over afterwards. Dance has an openness to change, and dance has an openness to this reuse and recycling of parts. In case of dance, it's people's bodies. That can give a work an identity over a long period of time. So my chapter is talking about how dance models can be used to think through these pieces over time. The more I tried to verify this, the more I got invested in the historical origin of the Onion, the more slippery it became, and the more I started thinking about it as a provocation for the people involved in museums as well as historians. So I hope you'll enjoy the chapter and be able to make those connections between, or follow my journey on how we can relate dance models of preservation to sculptural models. Thank you.
Thank you, Megan, for that provocation and those beautiful dancing onions, which I love as a kind of intermedia object, the onion. And again, if you have questions, comments, please share them. We'll get to them. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Andrea Gyorody, who is director of the Frederick R. Wiseman Museum of Art at Pepperdine University in Malibu, California. In addition to her work as a curator at several wonderful institutions, she is also an art historian, editor, and critic, and has contributed writing to many influential journals and magazines. Andrea's curatorial projects include Afterlives of the Black Atlantic, 2019 to 2020, which she co-curated with Matthew Francis Rary at the Allen Memorial Art Museum at Oberlin College, and the traveling exhibition Forms Larger and Bolder, Ava Hesse Drawings, 2019 to 2022, which she co-curated with Barry Rosen. Andrea, I'm looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Jules. Let me go ahead and share my screen.
I have to stop share. There we go.
There we go.
Floor is yours.
Thank you. Give me 1 second to pull this up. Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you, Jules, and thank you, Hanna, both for the invitation to share this work today, and Hanna for shepherding this volume, which was no small task. Before I delve in, I just want to note quickly that what I'm about to present does include nude photographs and more specifically images of bodies undergoing cancer treatment. I don't want to shy away from any of that material, which is pretty core to Hannah Wilke's work, but I don't want anyone to be caught off guard. So with that, I am very pleased to present here a very short version of my essay, Resurrecting Hannah Wilke's Homage to a Large Red Lipstick. In 2017, I began a position as curator of modern and contemporary art at the Allen Memorial Art Museum in Oberlin, Ohio, a college museum with an excellent collection. Soon after I arrived, I asked my predecessor whether I should know about any objects in disrepair that might be in need of attention. She ticked off a few works, including a latex-based sculpture by Hannah Wilke that had been unexhibitable for many years. Homage to a Large Red Lipstick, completed in 1974-75, makes cheeky reference to a project by Wilke's then boyfriend, Klaus Oldenburg, namely the renegade public sculpture he erected at Yale University in 1969. Perceived as a wry commentary on the Vietnam War, Oldenburg's Lipstick Ascending on Caterpillar Tracks featured a mock military tank topped with a partially flaccid tower meant to inflate and deflate, pointedly installed without permission in a spot that overlooked the office of Yale's president. It was eventually replaced with a more permanent version in a less prominent location on campus in 1974. That same year, Wilke began working on what would become Homage to a Large Red Lipstick, one in a series of latex-based sculptures she had been producing since around 1970, and these are just a few of many examples. Wilke's homage radicalized the feminizing motif of Oldenburg's monumental sculpture, substituting a form and palette inspired by flushed vaginal lips for Oldenburg's phallic lipstick, and an iconography of reproduction and proliferation for one of destruction and violence. By the time I examined Homage in storage, the work had been shelved for more than 40 years. The photograph we then had on file, regrettably in black and white, showed a wall-mounted sculpture comprised of uneven, wavy sheets in a range of tones, bound together into a long lozenge with the sheets fanning outward like an open accordion. What we found when we opened the box in which the work is housed today was something like a deflated version of what had once existed. This is usually when people in real life gasp out loud at this photo. The sculpture had been divided into several parts and stacked, separated by sheets of glassine in a single box. The once pliable, glossy latex sheets had shrunk in size and turned rigid and brittle. The pins that once held the sheets together, allowing them to cling on the wall in Wilke's intended shape, had migrated and dislodged, and the deep maroon that Wilke had tinted the latex had become much lighter and duller. The off-gassing that emanated from the boxes also signaled chemical rot. Homage had been effectively dead for the majority of its time in the collection, meaning that it has never been exhibited nor made available for research. Wilke's sculpture has been examined twice by conservators over the years, and both reports suggest that a combination of naturally fugitive materials and poor storage strategy have contributed to the work's demise. In 1986, the examining conservator wrote, "The latex material is chemically unstable and deterioration is in progress. In some areas, the latex has become hard and cracked. In other areas, it has become tacky and a number of pieces have stuck together. Because of this physical deterioration, the shape of the sculpture has changed. The original arrangement of the sections of the latex has been disrupted, and the lively three-dimensionality of the sculpture has been flattened." A conservator who assessed Homage in 2003 concurred, writing, "Homage to a Large Red Lipstick suffers from both chemical deterioration and improper treatment. These problems had already become critical barely 10 years after the sculpture was created. In the ensuing 17 years, the condition has only worsened. The piece is now fossilized in a shape which the artist never intended. At present, the only treatment which can be recommended is to freeze the object indefinitely, taking proper precautions to protect its surfaces. While this will not stop the deterioration, it would slow it so that at some point in the future, treatment for such a badly deteriorated latex art may be discovered. The demise of other latex-based works by Wilkie from this moment in her career suggests that even conscientious care might not have protected the work from inevitable decay. Wilkie herself was aware of the issue, and by late 1974, she had learned how to stabilize the material. Works produced after that time have, for the most part, fared dramatically better. That said, a cure for Wilkie's homage, given the extent of its deterioration, seems highly unlikely. In the meantime, it sits in the museum's basement, visible to no one, gathering proverbial dust. Dissatisfied with leaving homage in obscurity, I wondered whether Wilkie's practice might have allowed for entropy, change, decay, and even death in the case of her sculptural works. Whether, in other words, some aspect of her work might justify exhibiting homage as it is. Wilkie, who died from lymphoma in 1993, cannot be consulted, nor do we have evidence that she considered this particular proposition while she was still alive. But what I found in looking closely at Wilkie's wide-ranging body of work, extensive correspondence, and published interviews is that she not only allowed for decay, but radically embraced it. In the fuller essay, which you can read in the book, I contend that homage in its current state resonates with powerful aspects of Wilkie's body of work. Her sustained emphasis on gesture and ephemerality, the alignment between her physical self and the work she produced, and her commitment to representing the female body in its idealized and less than ideal forms, in health and in abject sickness. I make the case that homage ought to be displayed as it is, a curatorial decision that assumes a more generous and expansive understanding of what it means to preserve and care for works of art. Before I circle back to that conclusion, I just want to share a little bit of the argument that I make through Wilkie's work, especially for those joining us today who are less familiar with what she made in her lifetime. Vulnerability, in my view, is one of the defining features of Wilkie's approach to art making. From the way that she fastened latex sheets together with visible metal snaps, which you can see very clearly in this example, giving the work a provisionality and an erotic charge, to the many ways in which she aligned her often nude body with her work. And here you can see her with one of her installations of these latex rosettes in a work that was meant to be published in Art News, but was censored and printed instead with a clothed version of her. Here she is in photos that were privately kept that are in the archive here in Los Angeles of her pouring her latex works while naked, a common practice in her studio. And then here, a still from her incredible striptease with Marcel Duchamp's large glass at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, a video that, a performance that Hanna did in the museum and then became a video in 1976. Though there were critics who objected to what they saw as Wilkie's exploitation of her own sexuality to advance her artistic career, for Wilkie, beauty went hand in hand with disfiguration and attraction with repulsion, as her SOS series in particular makes clear. And in this series, which is perhaps one of her most famous works, she has bedecked herself with these tiny vulvas made of chewing gum that look quite a lot like boils or other kinds of bodily deformations. The statement she wrote for a Guggenheim Fellowship in 1976 summarizes the attitude she adopted. Quote, "Since 1960, I have been concerned with the creation of a formal imagery that is specifically female, a new language that fuses mind and body into erotic objects that are nameable and at the same time quite abstract. Its content has always related to my own body and feelings, reflecting pleasure as well as pain, the ambiguity and complexity of emotions. Human gestures, multi-layered metaphysical symbols below the gut level, translated into an art close to laughter, making love, shaking hands, chewing gum into androgynous objects, rearranging the touch of sensuality with a residual magic made from laundry lint or latex loosely laid out like love vulnerably exposed, continually exposing myself to whatever situation occurs, gamboling as well as gambling, end quote. Wilkie's openness to whatever situation occurs turned out to have profound and unexpected consequences for her. Unlike the other feminist artists of her time, most of whom stopped featuring their own naked bodies in their work when those bodies began bearing signs of age, Wilkie chose to photograph her own body at its absolute weakest, in the wake of her diagnosis with lymphoma in 1987, culminating in a body of work titled Intravenous. Unknowingly, Wilkie had prepared herself to wryly document her own bodily deterioration through the photographs she had made of her mother, Selma Butter, between 1978 and 1982, when cancer was ravaging her body, a body to which Wilkie was in so many ways intimately connected. And as you can see, she's making that connection rather evident in probably the best known work from this series, where she's pictured herself in a diptych along with her mother. There is no doubt that Wilkie's drive to document her mother's struggle with cancer, as well as her own, grew from an intense desire to remain productive and to survive, but the images themselves speak to the body's inevitable decay and demise, and to an interest in ephemerality that Wilkie had expressed earlier in her career, speaking of a desire to make things that, quote, aren't really about forever, or her admiration for art that has a, quote, planned obsolescence. The notion of obsolescence also appears in her letters to latex suppliers in the early 1970s. Though she was eagerly inquiring about a solution to latex's instability, she nonetheless admitted an awareness of the work's limitations. In a letter to General Latex and Chemical Corporation from September 1973, she writes, "I realize that complete permanency might be impossible to achieve, but I would be quite satisfied with being able to give a 10 to 20-year guarantee on the sculpture, more if possible." This rather radical acceptance of impermanence, her openness to whatever happens, to work that might cease to exist, to a notion of art that is not necessarily about forever, was not simply the price she paid for working with fugitive new materials. It is instead one of the most elemental features of her work, from her latex sculptures to her photographs of cancer-stricken bodies. The critical question, which was never posed to her in her lifetime, now comes into focus. When the work exceeds its 10 to 20-year guarantee and ceases to look and function as it once did, what should be done with it? This is precisely the conundrum presented by homage, which can continue to sit in storage, be destroyed, or go on view with or without some level of conservation. Many institutions would claim to be merely exercising caution in harboring but never exhibiting a work like homage. But to keep such a work indefinitely in storage is no doubt to impoverish it further. While the work is no longer in the form that Wilkie initially intended, it now speaks much more clearly and forcefully to the poetics of her body of work, to her deeply felt affinity for the gesture, arrested in time and space by the work of art, and for its eventual decay. Sometimes decay in works of art is distracting, and at other times, it is paradoxically illuminating. In the case of Wilkie's homage, we find a profound consonance between the sculpture's rapid decline and its place in an oeuvre that was increasingly focused on the body and its vulnerabilities. To borrow a phrase from curator Anne Temkin, homage in its present condition is, however improbably, quote, the state of the work of art that is right for itself. And as such, it deserves to be seen, to be enlivened, even if it cannot be made whole again. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. Thank you for that presentation. And I love that idea of enlivening artwork. Maybe that's a concept that we can keep in our heads for the discussion.
Thank you.
And now I will introduce our last speaker, last but not least, our third excellent Hanna of the evening. Hanna B. Higgins is professor of art history and founding director of the Interdisciplinary Education in the Arts, or IDEAS program at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Her wide interests in research and teaching include Dadaism, Surrealism, Fluxus, happenings, performance art, food art, and early computer art. Hanna has received many illustrious fellowships and written many excellent publications. of which I will particularly mention her books, Fluxus Experience from the University of California Press in 2002, and The Grid Book from the MIT Press in 2009. Hanna, I'm going to cross my fingers that your presentation will work. Can you unmute yourself? Ah, perfect. Great. And Hanna, if you would like me to run your presentation, just let me know.
Yeah, I think that's probably a good idea.
Okay, great.
First of all, thank you so much to Hanna Hölling. I think we first met while you were working with the Bard Graduate Center on the Zen for Film project, and it's such a pleasure to see this line of inquiry grow and evolve, thanks in large part to your work. So thank you so much. And my apologies to the group, all of you in the audience, and to my fellow presenters. I'm at a location with very poor Wi-Fi, so this was our compromise. I have no idea what, if any of me, you can actually see through the video. And I want to thank Jules for running my PowerPoint. So I thought what I would do is give a little bit of background for why the decision to publish a script in a publication like this. It was not in my introduction, but it matters that I'm the daughter of Dick Higgins and Allison Knowles, both Fluxus artists. And I didn't become an art historian in order to write about their work. My only book specific to Fluxus is actually Fluxus Experience. But as I was finishing my PhD back around 1992 and 3, I found myself at presentations, giving scholarly presentations that were the sort of academic side of larger conferences that also had artists, sometimes my folks, sometimes other performance people. And I was struck that for me, it's not that I wanted to be in the performances, it's that I was learning something fundamentally different from the performances than I was able to learn from the writing about them. And it's not a critique specifically. It just has to do with what's possible through embodied knowing and the limitations of description. And so in my dissertation, and then especially in Fluxus Experience, I really became fixated on what experience means. I was at the time reading a lot of John Dewey. John Dewey is associated with the progressive move in education, with participatory models of education, and specifically with the types of knowing that happen when an expert meets a student in the middle ground. So the point isn't to do away with experts, it's to use that middle domain as the place where education happens. And I know that these days that's what most educators are talking about and trying to do. But Dewey's model of experience became a kind of a magic key for thinking about what a Fluxus event is, and then what I might do by thinking about my academic performance of lectures using that model. And so, you know, one of Dewey's famous quotes, quote, "We always live at the time we live and not at some other time. And only by extracting at each present time the full meaning of each present experience are we prepared for doing the same thing in the future." So just rereading that. Only by extracting at each present time the full meaning of each present experience are we prepared for doing the same thing in the future. And so what that essentially says is that repetition is impossible, and as a result, I wrote against sort of strict reperformance. I think no one in this group would argue too passionately for that. And then I needed tools. I needed a mechanism for thinking about how that bridge might work. And so this is where I wrote the script with input from my mother called Fluxus with Tools. Next slide. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you very well. Yes, we can hear you great.
Next
Actually,
slide.
Is this the right slide?
Great.
Next one.
Slide. Next slide. Yeah, perfect.
Next.
And so, of course, this takes us to classrooms. And John Cage taught a course in experimental composition. The slide before that one, please. The Fluxus with Tools slide.
Wait.
This is one slide too late. That's okay. There we go. Perfect. So this is an advertisement. Sorry, slide number 2. Let's use the number.
Oh yeah, sorry. There's a bit of a delay. So the one with John Cage, yeah.
Yeah, the one with John Cage. And
Got
so
it.
this is an advertisement that that Cage published in the catalog for the New School course in 1956, and he taught this course several times. Then the ad says, experimental music, a course in musical composition with technological, musicological, and philosophical aspects open to those with or without previous training. Whereas conventional theories of harmony, counterpoint, and musical form are based on the pitch and frequency components of sounds, this course offers problems and solutions in the field of composition based on other components of sound: duration, timbre, amplitude, and morphology. The course also encourages inventiveness. So let's go to the next slide. The people in Cage's class came from chemistry. George Brecht was a chemist. They came from poetry. They were surely also trained artists, and they were committed to thinking about what music might be. Kind of, in a sense, I'm actually reminded of what Andrea was saying about Simone Forti, who's also ultimately ends up moving in this same circle. This notion of timbre is very much about a physical environment, the things that produce sound, and thinking about the philosophy in terms of those things was extremely rich for all of these people, especially for George Brecht, who invents the concept of the performance event in this class that's taught by Cage. Can we go to the next slide? So here's an event written by Milan Knizak. It's called Fashion Event, Cut a Coat Along Its Entire Length, Wear Each Half Separately, 1965. So in the lecture, I and sometimes my mother or some other performer reader, it could also be an art historian, would cut the coat one of us was wearing in half and give the other half to the other person, essentially splitting up our roles that we had to play, right? Stretching the concept of who is the artist and who is the historian. But you'll see most of what is in Fluxus with Tools contain this word event. Event is very specific, and it matters that it was conceptualized by George Brecht, right? In physics and in science, relativity is about a unique point in space-time. Space and time are not conceived as separate entities, but they interact in unique ways, neither of which is really at all stable, we now know from contemporary physics. Next slide, please. So in that fashion event by Milan Knizak, you need a coat and you need a pair of scissors, right? So tool being is a concept associated with Martin Heidegger in Being and Time. He writes about tool being. Tool being is not just the thing you use to cut the coat or to wear the coat. It's not just about the matter. It's also about the ways people can relate to each other. This would be a more contemporary slang concept, a person becoming a tool. And so tool being is a way of getting into the matter. So this became really interesting for me as a kind of way to think about, do we experience socially? Next slide. This is Allison's best known piece, probably, Make a Salad. This piece would run for the whole duration of the script. So make this so the salad table has been set up on the wherever you are, and whoever's not reading from the text, because we would take turns in the text, as you can see in the published script, can be essentially using the table to demonstrate this idea of tools and time and the inseparability of those two. Next slide, please. Orange Event number 16 by Bengt Klintberg. He's a really deeply underappreciated Swedish Fluxus artist. Here too, the oranges can be set anywhere in the space. And I hope that you're imagining that for the reader, for the person who's watching this play out, they're beginning to notice that the space they're in is becoming essentially an event space. Next image, please. Dripping by George Brecht. In this piece, a water pitcher or one source of pouring water and a glass or a container are put in some relationship to each other so that you hear the sound going into the water moving into the glass. Next image. Right here, we're moving into food. Next image. Sorry, I don't want to take up more than my time. This is Dick's Work with Butter and Eggs for a Time. We're back into the domain of food. You may also notice that a number of these pieces make weird sounds. There's chopping sounds, there's slopping sounds, there's dripping sounds. So they are in some way evoking the Cagean notion of non-musical sound, which is central to what he was teaching at the non-instrumental sound, I should say, in his course in composition. So Cage kind of pulls through all of this. Next, please. The duration slide. This notion of tool being and Heideggerian, that sort of Heideggerian thinking and Cage's interests and Brecht's interests was missing something really essential for me. I think it's a flaw in my first book. I have these fantasies of doing another version of it that accounts for maybe a less homogenized sense of the body, a less homogenized sense of what sensation is, a kind of opening up more to the global side of Fluxus. But it's what I could do at the time. But missing there was really, I think, a theory of time that could account for some of what, for example, what Gregory was talking about when he was talking about the onceness of Paik. This piece here by Larry Miller, Slab, is simply a coffin-sized slab of carrots that approximates his own weight. And then these three photographs show those same carrots over the course of time as they change. And Bergsonian time, the long duration, is cumulative. So time, essentially, there's no such thing really as a point in time that is separate from the points in time before and after it. Time is always accumulating meaning. And this is one of the challenges really of performance art. It's an issue that comes up over and over again, is how do we as scholars preserve the immediacy and the element of surprise that made the piece what it was when it was made. And this takes us back again to the Deweyan idea, the concept of always needing to renew experience in order to learn with it what's happening moving forward. That's very ultimately a very Bergsonian way of thinking about experience. And so this moves us, there's some humor here. Next image into, for example, Ben Vautier's Flux Mystery Food, which is canned food, right? Food that's supposed to last forever. So it's the opposite in a sense of what Larry Miller was doing with his piece in this example of Ben Vautier's Flux Mystery Food. He didn't know what was in the can, and you have beautiful videos of him opening these cans and eating kind of whatever was in it. It was a cheap way to buy food. It's one way that George Maciunas was able to live on such a low budget. You could go to the grocery store in the 1960s, and there would be a bin of cans where the labels had fallen off, and the food was basically free. So this was a way to eat for very little, but obviously it was a total crapshoot. Next slide. Actually, skip the next slide, or just move through it really fast because I'm way over time. I end Fluxus with tools, with a discussion of Fluxus banquets. These were events that happened in the late 60s and to the mid 1970s. Artists getting together and eating food together. This is an attempt at an art history joke. Obviously, this is a Bruegel image of conviviality, and I think conviviality is something that we could think about a lot more as scholars. I love Greg Cholette's work on dark matter for this, for really thinking about what communities of artists are like. And what the simple fact of community can do. And next image by Eric Anderson is the last piece. This is Eric evoking a kind of conviviality in his piece, Please Leave, from Roskilde in 1985, where he would have a table loaded with wonderful food, and he would then invite the audience to take something from the table, but once they took it, they had to leave. And so it evoked, tremendous tension between the desire to stay and see what's going to happen next, or to depart with the good thing. So, and folks not wanting to seem greedy for the good thing, but also not wanting to seem kind of greedy for an experience that ultimately became quite dull, right? Sitting for hours waiting while this thing played out. So also very much about time, but obviously with regard to this question of the preservation of performance, the main point of Anderson's piece is that what people desire is a product of kind of who they are and where they live and what matters to them and what their values are and what their relationship is to everyone in the room. And that's what makes the piece fresh. So in terms of this question of over-reliance on photographs of performance, while photographs are indeed very useful, to try to meticulously reconstruct this photograph in order to produce anything like the experience of that day would be patently absurd. And so this is where the limits of photography with regard to performance are, as this group knows extremely well. I'm seeing it in every presentation. Really a problem for scholars. So Hanna, I see your work is so involved and so engaged and relevant for what we're all trying to do here. And thank you very much for giving us a context. And thank you all for your patience with my terrible technology. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Hanna, and please stick around. I invite all of the speakers to turn on their audio, turn on their cameras, and join us. I saw that we had a question in the chat about whether this will be recorded. We are recording this, which is also good to know if you wanted to ask a question. So please go ahead and join the conversation in the chat. But I, as MC of this evening's event, get the pleasure and privilege of the first question. And I was thinking about what brings all of these different contributions together. And one idea that really struck me was, as Hanna was picking up on as well just now, this idea of onceness from Nanjun Paik, and this wonderful idea he has that you can only break a piano once, right? Then it's broken and you can't put it back together. And essentially what he's describing there is entropy, right? Which is interesting to me because entropy is so often what conservation is working against. So I wonder if any of you have any comments on how entropy as a kind of positive force in art is something that we can use to reconsider how we think about the kind of long-term life of an artwork. And if I had a follow-up question, it would probably be about homeostasis and neg entropy, since we have so many works that involve food as well. It's a question for everybody, so feel free to jump in.
I can start if I may. It's a very interesting question, Jules. Thank you so much, and thank you again, everyone who contributed for this wonderful interventions. I really like the question about entropy because I think conservation is sometimes perhaps too easily associated with this notion that it works against entropy. I mean, in kind of perhaps classical conservation, quite often related to traditional works of art, such as painting, sculpture, more stable works of art. Obviously, today we are moving away from those notions more and more, and nonetheless, they are pretty useful in many contexts. This kind of the achievement of stability is something that we really kind of try to pursue through the kind of more traditional lens, but more and more in those works, especially created since the mid-20th century, it is quite often the case that conservation actually accepts changeability and change in works existing extant in time. And I believe that if we go away from perhaps this kind of iterant installative work that materialize intermittently but look closer at, I don't know, also a painting that decays over time, or as this wonderful artworks by Larry Miller that Hanna Higgins just brought up. I think the acceptance of this changeability involves also the acceptance of entropy. And I think in Andrea Gyorody's, beautiful contribution with Hannah Wilke's pieces, this kind of bringing back to the limelight of a piece that actually, according to say, perhaps a standard or more conventional look or approach, an artwork which would be long gone and perhaps it would spend its entire life in the storage, would be no more kind of conservable, no more kind of appreciated for its obviously really appealing aesthetics as well. I think if we rethink this notion of conservation, if we approach it truly as something that not only manages, this was another notion I think that was very present over the last decades, but something that accepts change, that even invites change and tries to kind of be constructed and theorize along those notions, that then we are fine with them. I could speak more, but I'm gonna read over.
Andrea, yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, I'm gonna jump in. Hanna, thank you for starting that, because I think, yes, there is certainly much more acceptance around changeability in conservation practice now, but I think there's still this question of how much entropy do we allow before the artwork becomes part of the archive or a relic and no longer the work itself. And I struggled with that question around Wilke's work, and I looked to her for instruction as to whether her practice would allow me to think about that work as still the work and not simply as a relic or, an archival object, and no longer, the proper work of art. But I think that's where there continues to be disagreement. And there are a lot of artist estates that weigh in on these questions and want to say, that work doesn't look like when the artist made it, and now it needs to be relegated to the archive and can no longer be shown as the work. So there are other, sort of constituencies that weigh in on these questions too, beyond just conservators and curators. But that, I think, is a really critical question when we're talking about works that have this fugitive quality.
Yeah, thanks for that, Andrea. I would just add to that I think entropy, and maybe more specifically to someone like Peck, destruction is a way of challenging hierarchical value systems. Saying if you're going to destroy an old instrument, for example, you are making a comment about what is valued, right? The object versus a person, an institutional affiliation versus a public. They're even though we think of destruction as, bad in a lot of ways, there are ways that it can really release a lot of different energies and allow us to ask a lot of different questions.
Mm.
Yeah, and I would also add, since I think Megan unfortunately had to leave us, I think the onion walk is a great example of a form of destruction, right? An onion that has sprouted is an onion that's no longer good to eat, right? But it's exactly the release of energies that allows the onion to walk.
I love that, because I think what this gets at is the recognition. Christine Stiles has written about this really beautifully. That destruction creation, right? Mm-hmm. That the onion that is never allowed to sprout is dead, right? Mm-hmm. And we're really advocating for something here that has a kind of ethics of a certain kind of attitude of living and being part of futurity. And I think I took a note when Greg was talking. I said, onceness is democratic, and I think that is so absolutely kind of the right attitude. There's an ethics in this conversation that goes so far. I mean, it's what art can do, right? Art can provisionally propose alternatives to our dominant mindsets, and this work and this thinking is so critical politically right now. And so I commend this, not just as scholars kind of in our bubble in a sense, but attitudinally. Sorry for the rant. But I think it's kind of remarkable to hear this so crisply said. And certainly Hanna Wilke's cancer is the chaos into which every one of our bodies recycles, right? And that's in the Miller piece too. Mm. Oh, I had one other thought. Sorry, and that is, since I'm connected to an artist estate, my father's, obviously my mother's doing just fine, but in a life, I think there can be a feeling when you're young that you'll always have great ideas and be producing the work that matters. And so if I look at a lot of artists, they are more willing to destroy and to engage in creative destruction as young artists than when they kind of hit a certain age. And I'm not sure why that is, but it's certainly true of even like a Chris Burden, or it just seems to happen. And I wonder if any of you have any thoughts about that? Like, what is the relationship between some of these ideas and biography?
Can I jump in to
that's
say
a great question
thing there, which is that, I think something that I've encountered quite a bit is young artists who, and this is true even now when I do studio visits and I have this conservation mindset and I ask artists, do you know what the longevity of that material is? Like how, you know, how is it going to behave in 5 years, 10 years? And we think of plastic as this thing that can exist forever. And of course it does not. It has an expiration date within our lifetimes. And so there is this, I think, kind of like beautiful carefreeness around materiality where you're worried about the now when you're making the work. And it's as artists get to a different point in their career, and have resources like conservators they can call up to ask questions about the materials they're working with, that mindset shifts. But you know, that I think then those objects wind up in museum collections, obviously, and we wonder, okay, what do we do with this thing that was made with kind of provisional materials, maybe because that's what was available, and we know it's going to have an expiration date in terms of it looking as it once did.
That's so are you saying, Andrea, that that these are different orders of time, that the young artist hasn't seen the materials begin to decay, whether they're ever going to wind up in a museum is kind of a separate question, and that as they move through their creative life, they see that decay and they realize like a decade or 20 years is actually very little time.
Yep.
Interesting.
Absolutely. Yeah, I just had a studio visit with somebody and I asked them about this sort of latex-based material that they were layering onto plastic. And I asked, you know, do you know if this changes over time? Like, is it going to discolor? Is it going to get brittle? And they said, oh, I've been working with it for a year. It's fine. And I was like, oh God, a year is short. This thing is maybe going to live, you know, for a much longer time. And I just said, okay, you know, that's great. I didn't want to burst their bubble, but those, you know, I think that, yeah, over the course of a career, you get to see what happens with your work in a way that you don't when you're young and playing in the studio.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I can add to this, if I may jump on. It's very interesting what you are just saying, Andrea and Hanna too, because you know, especially from the perspective of conservators, we are doing conducting quite a lot of artist interviews, and you know, very kind of material. We pursue very material-oriented approaches often, and in our questions, we ask the artists what kind of materials they use, are they kind of durable or not, and so on. And it itself is kind of intervention in longevity, right? Because you know, even by kind of posing this question, one implies that the work have to kind of continue, which is interesting. But I love that you know, that artists actually have this changeability sometimes planned into the work and sometimes not. It is intended or unintended. Sometimes this, you know, the change or the destruction even of materials is kind of intrinsic or even internal to the work, and sometimes it is external. So there is a huge complexity I think one could speak about. And going back to Pike, obviously, you know, he's a wonderful example, and I bet Greg will also agree as Pike's scholar, that you know, in his early age he was almost termed, you know, a destruction artist with very kind of all these performative gestures where he destroys instruments, you know, paints with own heads, and has kind of, yeah, a very almost brutal approach to art making.
Yeah, thanks everyone. I'm sure we could go on about these issues, but I'd also like to, we have some great questions in the chat, and I'd like to share with you a question from Jane Henderson. Hi, Jane, who says, I would enjoy hearing you all elaborate on the idea that objects can die. If we accept the premise that they can die, how do we define the death of an object? And what is the role of conservation in this? Are we the ones holding a metaphorical watch in the ER ward, calling it, or do we just wheel away the bodies? And I think I love this question. I think this question was actually asked before Hanna started talking about the kind of biographical, you know, the life cycle that we all human beings go through and how that affects the way we might feel about our own artistic production or about that of others. And of course, also the life cycle of an onion, the life cycle of a bunch of carrots. So yeah, does anyone have any thoughts on Jane's question? Do artworks die?
Andrea, you want to go? I can.
Sure. I mean, my very short answer is yes. But I think, defining the limits of like when to call it in the ER is the really hard part, because I think, I've seen artworks that I did, and this is a shout out to anybody who would be eligible for this program. There's a fantastic summer institute in technical art history that now happens at Harvard, but it used to happen at NYU at the IFA. That I did back in the summer of 2013. And I think if I had not done that institute, seeing Wilkie's work in storage would have meant something very different to me. But having done that institute, we had, really like backdoor access to conservation at MoMA and the Met and other places, and could have very honest conversations about works of art that otherwise we would never have been allowed to see. And I remember seeing, I think it was like a tiny fiberglass work by Naum Gabo, or another Russian constructivist, and it had just been shattered into little pieces. And there is literally no way that anyone could take that from that back to anything sculptural. Like, it's just not possible. So that is a work that I would feel comfortable saying is dead. They keep it in, sort of a little shoebox in the archive because the material seems to still have value to them, but it's not something that could ever be shown. Whereas with Wilkie's work, it's like, yes, this has been sort of effectively declared dead by a conservator, but simply because it can't hang on the wall like it once did. And my question there is, okay, but what else can we do with it? Like, is it still alive in a different sense than it once was? And, I think with every work of art, there's a case study to be had in thinking about where those lines and boundaries are.
Yeah, I would just add to that I think, and many of you have much more experience with conservation than I do. So, but I will say that, art is more than its material components, right? I mean, it's also ideas and concepts. And so I think of something like Pake's TV Crown when it's in a museum now. And originally you were supposed to be able to come in and turn the dials and create images yourself, right? Now you can't, you're not allowed to touch it, right? So it's been materially preserved. But I would say it's kind of a brain dead version of the piece, because what's not being preserved is the interactivity and the sort of invitation for the viewer to become a producer, right? To become an image maker. And so that's another thing that I always get hung up on, which is like, there's the material conservation, but there's also the conceptual or the idea, how can you preserve an idea?
Yes, and also I think that's beautifully put. But I also think, and I must say, I admit the SISTA is one of the best programs that happens, organized currently by Francesca Bauer at the Harvard, and I have this possibility to contribute to this program as well. So a great mention, Andrea. Thank you. But I must say that I think that it very much also relates to our conception of the artwork itself, our understanding what the artwork is. If we, for instance, assume, and Jane is writing in the comments about the bits and pieces in the box, whether, what are the perceived value of this. I think if we take performance and think of performance as only the live event, right, that happens in the moment, and nothing else that is, so say, the leftovers, perhaps the embodied knowledge and all this kind of documentation and stratigraphies of different sorts of documents that happen around performance. If we conceive performance as only the events, then it might be that the relics are the dead object. But if we think about it in a more kind of all-encompassing way, then the remnants might also live on and even perhaps have their own performances. And I tend to think about Pike artworks in this terms. Obviously, one can see a ton of them for TV in a gallery, exposing just this kind of burns in the line, in the phosphor coating of the monitor as a dead work. But in fact, I believe that, it is in a sense, still the work, perhaps lacking one of its many performative components.
Excellent points, everyone. We've got a lot going on in the chat. We have a question from Heather Galloway. Thank you, Heather. Aren't museums, in a larger sense, rather than the conservator, by not showing an object, sending the message that the object is dead? Conservation doesn't have to write the death certificate. That's right, conservators aren't the only ones making these decisions. And as you point out, Heather, it might not always necessarily even be a conscious decision, right? Objects can be kind of in limbo. Well, I think we probably should start wrapping up, unless there are any final comments. I mean, we could certainly go on.
Other authors still with us that could perhaps turn on their screens and say hi,
yes.
At least. Other contributors to the volume. I'm seeing Susanna Neubauer writes, unfortunately I have to leave, and thank yous. But perhaps there is still someone around that we could say, oh, Hanna is still around, this is great. We see your image. I'm hearing Johannes in the next room, but I'm not quite sure if he's maybe sitting now, if he's able to turn on his screen.
Rebecca's here, but has to leave.
Yeah,
yes,
Rebecca just left.
It was great to have you, Rebecca. That's great that you could join.
This was really lovely. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, Hanna. Thank you for your wonderful contributions.
Really, really lovely. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks so much. I give the word back to Jules, right? Jules, you will probably wrap up. This would be the moment. But I just want to thank everyone. Oh, Johannes is here. Hi, Johannes, author of the last chapter in the volume on his blog project. So there's a processual piece that travels the world. And Jules is wrapping up, so I'm giving the screen over to her.
Yes, I just want to say thank you to everyone. Thank you to Hanna. Thank you to all of the speakers. Thank you to all of the wonderful contributors to this really exciting book. Who were with us tonight, who are not. Thank you to everyone who came, especially to everyone who's still here. You get extra points. Thank you very much to Sophia Fries, who was our crack technical assistant this evening. Many thanks to the SNF and the HKB for their support. And before we all go our separate ways for the morning, afternoon, or evening, I would just like to make everyone aware of the next event happening within the frame of the Performance Conservation Project. We're having our first in-person event, but it will also be streamed online. But come join us in Bern if you can. We have a number of really exciting artists who've already agreed to take part on May 16th, speaking about their interests and experiences with performance conservation from many different angles. And there are going to be some live performances as well. So we'd really love to see you there. And if you want to stay up to date with our future activities, I recommend that you sign up for our, I promise, very sporadic newsletter. And thank you all for your comments and for joining us today. We'll see you hopefully next time.